Members and guests, it's my pleasure to introduce Kevin Gallagher today. Kevin Gallagher joined Santos as Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer in February 2016, bringing more than 25 years international experience in the oil and gas industry. Since joining Santos, Kevin has led a significant transformation and growth, delivering a competitive advantage in energy transition. Under his leadership, Santos is now Australia's second largest independent natural gas and liquids producer after implementing a focused strategy to build and grow around 5 core long-life producing natural gas assets in Australia, Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste. This strategy has included successful acquisitions of Quadrant Energy and ConocoPhillips Australia West business, and of course recently the merger with Oil Search. Kevin has implemented a disciplined, low-cost operating model and strengthened the balance sheet, creating a strong, cash-generative business. This has propelled Santos into the top 20 ASX and the top 20 companies in the oil and gas sector globally. Kevin Gallagher has positioned Santos to leverage the critical role that natural gas will play in delivering energy security through the energy transition to net zero emissions. He has implemented a decarbonisation strategy, building around the company's existing infrastructure by developing natural gas projects for backfill and growing new revenue streams and reducing emissions through carbon capture and storage and clean fuels such as hydrogen. Under his leadership, Santos has made the world's first booking of carbon storage reserves and taken a final investment decision on one of the world's biggest CCS projects in South Australia's Cooper Basin. Commencing his career in the oil and gas industry as a drilling engineer in Scotland, then working with Mobil in the North Sea, Kevin migrated to Australia to join Woodside in 1998. Having built a strong, low-cost base business supplying natural gas to meet ongoing customer demand and laid out an action plan to develop cleaner energy and fuels with an ambitious target of net zero Scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2040, Kevin Gallagher is committed to ensuring Santos remains resilient, value accretive, and at the leading edge of energy transition. Kevin comes from a small town just outside of Stirling in South Australia. However, after more than 20 years here, he still has a strong and identifiable Scottish accent. A fervent supporter of Celtic in the Scottish Premier League, a big fan of rugby union, and in particular the Australian Wallabies, and a passionate West Coast Eagles supporter in the AFL, Kevin has lived in Adelaide for 6 years with his wife and 3 children. Members and guests, please welcome Kevin Gallagher to the Melbourne Mining Club.
Thank you, John, and I promise I will have a word with my corporate affairs group, because that must be the longest bio I've heard as part of any introduction for a long time. Minister, Honourable Jarlath Pilford, members and guests, I'd just like to start by saying that I too acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and the 23 traditional owner groups and 6 Aboriginal land councils who Santos works with in our operations around Australia. It's an absolute pleasure and an honour to be here today with the leaders of Australia's resources sector, a sector that contributes around 10% of Australia's gross domestic product, directly employs 250,000 of Australian workers, accounts for about 70% of the nation's exports, and generated record export earnings of $425 billion last financial year. A sector that is still a powerhouse of the Australian economy and part of our social fabric. The last time I was at a miners' club I was playing the bagpipes with the Alloa Colliery Pipe Band at the Fishcross Miners Welfare Club in central Scotland. Coal mining is probably Scotland's oldest major industry, dating back to the 12th century. At its peak, in the first half of the last century, mines stretched coast to coast across the country, from Ayr in the west to Fife in the east. While the free market reforms of Margaret Thatcher were its death warrant, the demise of coal began with competition from cheaper fuels and the emergence of nuclear power soon after the Second World War. This included North Sea oil boom from the late 1960s. But the real story of coal in Scotland is a social and political one. The rise of industrialisation and economic growth in towns and villages across the country. The benefit of secure employment contrasted with new occupational hazards of the industrial age. A story of struggle in those same towns and villages when mines and industries closed, towns and villages which remain disadvantaged to the current day. And a story of rising concern about climate change that was just emerging at the end of Scotland's coal era. That story gave rise to Scottish nationalism and today's fierce independence movement. The same pressures are just as relevant today in Australian resources. The forces of competition, advances in technology driving changes in demand, and above all, the energy transition and our social licence. How we navigate through these issues will shape Australia's future social fabric and prosperity. We can already see the fault lines between regional and outer suburban Australia and the wealthiest electorates in our cities, nowhere more starkly than in the results of the recent federal election. Our task is to help build a more united and outward-looking Australia through our investment in regional communities right around Australia, through the safe, secure and well-paid jobs we provide, through care for our workforce, Indigenous cultural heritage and the environment, through meaningful climate action, and through a just energy transition. Now is not the time to look inward. Global trade and investment has been the foundation of Australia's prosperity for more than half a century, providing good jobs for Australian workers, generating export income and government revenues which have paid for our high-quality infrastructure and services, from transport to health and education, and providing access to international markets at a scale that has enabled us to support our own smaller domestic market at the same time. Inward-looking nationalism is a recipe for fewer jobs, a weaker economy, and poorer communities. We do not want an energy transition that looks like the demise of Scottish coal. As we seek to decarbonise our economy, including the mining industry, what I want to leave with you today is a sense of the criticality of natural gas and carbon capture and storage in achieving that goal. I was talking to Sanjeev Gandhi this morning, the CEO of Orica, and he told me how critical Orica is to the world mining industry. And Orica's ammonium nitrate industry is almost entirely dependent on natural gas supply. As a producer country, we take for granted the wealth of the resources and guarantee of our energy security and our modern living standards. But the concerns of consuming nations who don't have the resources we do are very different. Having just returned from Japan and Korea, what was most striking to me was the level of concern about energy security, their energy security, because they recognise that national security starts with energy security. Our customers in Asia want to be assured that they can continue to rely on Australian resources for another 30 years or more to provide the energy security that they need for social stability and economic prosperity. The energy security to underpin their manufacturing industries, which supply the motor vehicles, computers, televisions, electrical and white goods found in every home here in Australia. Australia simply cannot retreat from its global role as a supplier of the critical fuels and minerals that support the peaceful, rules-based world we've all enjoyed for the last 7 decades. Australia's competitive advantage is our natural resources and the ingenuity of our people in developing them. This is a role we should be proud of. Australia has helped to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in Asia over more than half a century. Yet, last year, the world saw a reversal in global progress towards achieving universal access to clean and affordable energy. There are now more people in the world without access to reliable electricity than before the pandemic. At the same time, global CO2 emissions from energy combustion and industrial processes reached their highest level ever. Coal-fired power plants meant half that increase in global electricity demand in 2021, with total coal generation also reaching an all-time high. This occurred despite renewables-based electricity generation also reaching an all-time high. However, according to the World Health Organization, the increase in emissions from coal-fired power generation in 2021 wiped out all the avoided emissions from renewables. The gains the world had made from coal to gas switching, saving around 500 million tonnes from 2010 to 2018, also reversed. Those gains are equivalent to replacing 200 million cars with electric vehicles running on zero-carbon electricity over the same period. But as gas demand increased, a lack of new supply saw prices rise, and some countries switched back from gas to coal. This was a direct consequence of producer nations' policies, slowing down new gas supply. We are watching an energy crisis play out in Europe right now, but we have on our East Coast a prime example of what happens if the energy transition is focused only on stopping new oil and gas projects. We've had a decade of moratoriums, shutdowns and lockouts in resource-rich states and territories, 14 scientific inquiries into the safety of onshore gas development, all of which concluded that our activities can be conducted safely. As I have said for a number of years, the scarcity of new developments today is frightening, with forecasts of tight supply over the coming years. Since 2012, Santos has spent more than $1.5 billion trying to get our Narrabri gas project approved and developed, a project that is 100% committed to the domestic gas market. Customers are crying out for this gas with more demand than we can meet when it comes to market around 2026. And I am trying to bring Narrabri to market earlier than that, if that is possible. Shortages in the domestic market and the price shocks that we have seen in recent weeks have nothing to do with the behaviour of gas producers or exporters who are doing everything they can to support the market right now. This is the consequence of more than a decade of energy policy failure that has stopped the industry developing more gas supply in a timely manner. As a result, our energy system is no longer resilient enough to cope with short-term coal generator shutdowns, high coal prices, up 400% on last year, that are limiting access to coal for generators and diverting more coal to exports, interconnector maintenance, low solar generation, down more than 25% in May compared to April, pipeline capacity constraints, and the bursts of cold weather that we're experiencing right now on the East Coast. This is an unprecedented confluence of events. Gas demand here in Victoria yesterday and today, the first 2 days of winter, is about the same as at the peak day last winter. East Coast gas use in May was up by a massive 35% on April and accounted for almost 10% of East Coast electricity generation, not because of gas exports, but because the energy system simply cannot cope with coal outages and unexpected events such as low renewables generation. Up until April this year, domestic gas prices have been tracking for many months at about 1/3 of the LNG netback price at Wallumbilla. Ironically, there has been much hype over the last week about the UK's introduction of a profits tax on the oil and gas industry, but no mention of the 80% investment allowance that was a key element of that policy. The real story of last week's profit tax was the incentive to invest in more supply as the UK desperately seeks solutions to offset meteoric wholesale energy price rises. The message from the UK is invest in more supply or pay more tax. It comes at a time when companies in our sector around the world are being asked to return more to shareholders, who are being pressured not to support investment in new oil and gas supply projects. But we need investment in both new supply to support our existing energy system and the decarbonisation projects that will enable an orderly transition, not the chaos we are seeing today. This is the only way the world can achieve net zero by 2050 and continue to work towards other important human development goals, such as universal access to reliable energy and lifting people out of poverty. As I've said many times, more supply is the only sustainable way to put downward pressure on prices and ensure liquidity of supply in the market. We must maintain the momentum of the energy transition without compromising energy security, and that includes affordability. And we can only do this through decarbonisation, not defossilization. The oil age that started in the 1800s has enabled the biggest leap in human progress ever, and it occurred over just a couple of hundred years. Demonising fossil fuels will only lead to higher prices. Life expectancy has more than doubled globally since 1900, and the wide inequality in life expectancy across the globe has an undeniable correlation with access to reliable, affordable energy and everything that enables. Oil, gas, coal still make up about 80% of primary energy, the same as 45 years ago. And the world will still be using oil and gas in 2050, according to the International Energy Agency's most ambitious scenario for net zero by 2050. Renewables can make great inroads into the electricity sector, but electricity accounts for only 20% of total energy. The other 80% is fuels and feedstocks. And today, we simply don't have alternatives to replace oil and gas in the myriad uses that go far beyond electricity generation and transport. Those uses include the fertilizers that have allowed us to produce more food using less water and less land, the cement and steel that have built our modern cities, and the polymers that are the building blocks for the clothing, plastics, and chemicals that we use every single day. More than half the natural gas produced today is consumed in sectors other than electricity and transport. It's used to make things. So if we want to be an economy that makes things, we're going to need oil and gas, because renewables cannot replace them as feedstocks for fertilizers and polymers, or in high temperature applications such as brick and cement kilns, steel furnaces, and aluminium pot lines. There is a fundamental disconnect between what the world says it wants from the energy transition and its consumption patterns. In the Asian region, LNG demand is set to double by 2050. China, Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and India are all set or all forecast, I should say, to consume more LNG in 2050 than they did in 2020. In these markets, LNG will replace dirtier fuel sources for direct cooking and heating and allow for further electrification of these growing economies and the phase-out of coal over time. With 10 LNG projects and 89 million tonnes of capacity spanning Western Australia, the Northern Territory and Queensland, Australia is a very important supplier of LNG across the Asian region, with a 40-year history of stable and reliable supply. And thanks to our large natural gas resources of nearly 270,000 petajoules, the opportunity is there for us to continue to supply Asia for at least another 30 years. Importantly, that will also ensure our own energy security, because it's been investment from our partners and our customers in Asia that has always enabled us to develop our natural resources here in Australia, both for export and to provide for our own needs. Without the investment, or without that investment, the small size of Australia's domestic market compared with Asian markets could never have underpinned the scale of capital required to develop resources like Queensland's Gold Seam gas or remote offshore gas in northwestern Australia. But energy security, globally and at home, must also come with emissions reduction. The 6% increase in CO2 emissions we saw in 2021 was in line with the rise in global economic output, the strongest coupling of CO2 emissions with gross domestic product growth since 2010. So if we're serious about decarbonisation and the energy security to keep our economy strong, we must find ways to make natural gas and other hydrocarbons cleaner. No technology can make a bigger difference to the energy transition than carbon capture and storage, with the IEA saying it will be almost impossible to achieve net zero by 2050 without it. However, the new focus on stopping oil and gas projects in environmentally responsible jurisdictions, such as Australia, is centred around discrediting CCS, a proven technology for low-cost, large-scale emissions reduction. Carbon capture and storage will enable us to reduce emissions from the production of natural gas and LNG, but more importantly, it provides the opportunity to help our customers reduce or offset emissions from consumption. And CCS will enable the production of clean fuels, such as hydrogen, from natural gas, eliminating Scope 1, 2 and Scope 3 emissions, and very importantly, at prices the customers will be willing to pay. In 2050, under the IEA's net zero scenario, about half the world's gas production would be used to make hydrogen, and about 40% of the world's hydrogen would be made from natural gas. We know CCS works. It's been done before, and there are now 27 commercial projects operating around the world today. Now, most of these are in the United States, which is a policy framework that strongly incentivizes CCS, including through tax credits and an investment by the Department of Energy of more than $10 billion US dollars to accelerate CCS, direct air capture, and industrial emissions reduction. The biggest CCS project in the world, however, is here in Australia at Gorgon's LNG project in Western Australia. It has successfully stored 6 million tonnes of CO2 since it started up in 2019. And at Santos, we are building a 1.7 million tonne per year CCS project at Moomba in South Australia's Cooper Basin. And the exciting thing about the Cooper Basin is that there is storage capacity for up to 20 million tonnes of CO2 per year for up to 50 years. Not only will our Moomba project be one of the biggest in the world, it will be one of the lowest cost at around $24 per tonne. That is very competitive compared to prices in a number of carbon markets. At Moomba, we're also trialling CSIRO and other direct air capture and post-combustion capture technologies. These exciting technologies have the potential to negate emissions elsewhere in the economy, especially in hard-to-abate sectors that Australia still needs. Sectors that manufacture essential everyday products like fertilisers, mining explosives, cement, steel and polymers. Earlier this year, Santos and our joint venture partners commenced front-end engineering and design on our Bayu-Undan CCS project in the Timor Sea, northwest of our Darwin LNG project. We are looking at a storage capacity of around 10 million tonnes of CO2 per year, using existing infrastructure once production from the field ceases. This would enable us to store 2.3 million tonnes of CO2 per year from the Barossa gas project, making it one of the lowest carbon intensity LNG projects in the world. Bayu-Undan is a low-cost, large-scale commercial CCS proposal that could also store CO2 from our customers in Asia. And this was the subject of some of my discussions in Japan and Korea last week. It is a serious proposition that CO2 could be captured in industrial processes offshore and shipped to Australia, if we are willing to take advantage of that opportunity to build a new carbon storage business using our vast natural resources. In Western Australia, we are looking at the potential for our reindeer facilities to be used for CCS when gas production ends. Reindeer is close to large industrial sources of CO2. And large demand sources for natural gas and potentially hydrogen, including in the Pilbara iron ore province, where decarbonising the mining fleet and reducing diesel dependence is one of the industry's key challenges. Just as our customers in Asia have looked to Australia for energy resources for decades, they are now looking to us to help them decarbonise their economies through CCS. Importantly, our CCS projects are at the low end of the global CCS cost curve, giving Santos and Australia a critical competitive advantage at a time when the need to accelerate CCS deployment globally has never been greater. According to the IEA's Net Zero by 2050 scenario, CCS will be required to store 7.6 billion tonnes of CO2 every year by 2050, nearly 200 times the amount we store each year today. This is a fantastic opportunity for Australia to grow our LNG trade and investment and build new, exciting opportunities in decarbonisation through carbon capture and storage and clean fuel projects such as hydrogen. It is also the best way for Australia to deliver a just energy transition, utilising the skills of our existing workforce, our existing infrastructure, and the nation's large carbon storage resources to develop low-cost, low-carbon LNG and clean fuels for our customers in Australia and Asia. This is a smart energy transition for Australia that will keep our regional communities strong, continue to generate export earnings, government revenues and jobs, and provide the affordable, reliable energy we need to support our domestic economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And we'll now take some questions from the floor. We might get the lights up a little bit so that I can see. Thank you. Richard and Sam have some microphones out there. If you'd like to ask a question, please state your name and your affiliation. Oh, no questions. Can't be. No, here we go.
Sure. Thank you.
Thanks.
My name is Jeff Croker, and I'm an owner of a company that develops hydrogen in Australia. So I think that what I'm hearing, Mr. Gallagher, is that you are going to have a vast amount of CO2 in reserves, as opposed to the methane comes out of the reserve, you put the CO2 back in the reserve. Now, for a company like I own, this is a wonderful opportunity to do something with that CO2. And, if you like, close out the energy loop in the gas market. My question is, would Santos be interested in developing a ways and means of cycling hydrogen through the system, making into methane? There's plenty of ways to move methane around the system. Hydrogen is a very difficult thing to move around the system. And closing out the energy loop. Because if we do that in Australia, we're obviously got the world.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Jeff. Look, I think it's an interesting question. If I don't quite get it, feel free to pull me up, but I think I get the gist of the question. What I would say is, and I'll talk about what we are doing as Santos as opposed to the industry, because I think the industry will be looking at very similar things, but we're looking at uses for everything that comes out of the well, everything that makes up our methane mix, CO2, any other inerts that are in there as well. And from a utilisation point of view, if we can use it first commercially, if there's a commercial opportunity to use that first, and CO2 in this instance, there are a number of different opportunities we're looking at how we can use CO2 as a product as opposed to just putting it back in the ground. But if we can't use it, then obviously CCS allows us to put that back in the ground. I think what you're talking about is opportunities not only like hydrogen, which, as you rightly point out, the biggest challenge of which is transportation and mobilisation, moving around the system, and particularly if you want it to be an export product. Very expensive, very challenging, as you would know. CO2 mixed with green hydrogen gives you the opportunity to make synthetic methane, to create synthetic methane, which can move around the system. And when I was recently in Japan, the Japanese were talking to me about that as an opportunity going forward, from the perspective that if we were to export hydrogen to Japan, they would only get about a third, even if all the infrastructure could be used for hydrogen, about a third of the energy they can take through that infrastructure today with gas because of the energy density of hydrogen compared to methane, to natural gas. And so they would much rather we sold them synthetic methane than hydrogen because they can use existing infrastructure to move that around their system. And that's probably the biggest use you can have for CO2 today is to mix it with green hydrogen to make synthetic methane. And I think the way this plays out, nobody can really predict today. But what I would say that companies like Santos, to answer your question, yes, we are looking at multiple opportunities to use the CO2 productively. We probably don't know about half of those opportunities yet, but I think the will is certainly there and the intent is there to do that, to use everything that comes out of that well productively. And we are so rich. We've got an abundance of these resources here in Australia. If we can crack this code, we can be an energy superpower for decades to come. We are today, and we can continue to be.
Thank you very much. My name's Gavin Lind. I'm the CEO of the Australian Minerals and Energy Skills Alliance, one of the 3 federally funded skills organisations. You did briefly mention existing workforce skills, and I was curious to know what your thoughts on future skills, and particularly your existing workforce, future workforce, and what we might need to do to address the challenges that you've highlighted today. Thank you.
Well, look, I mean, first of all, I think this is a really hot topic, right? And I used the reference to what I saw in Scotland, where there really wasn't a skills replacement programme. And so, you know, there are families, generations of families on benefits now in Scotland as a consequence of not replacing those industries that basically just got shut down in very short notice. And we don't want that to be the case here in Australia. I'm optimistic, though, because mining and oil and gas is not going away. It can't. I mean, the evidence we're seeing every single day with the gas crisis here on the East Coast, what we're seeing in Europe, tells us the world needs it. There's nothing to turn to if you turn the tap off. And so it's not going away for a long, long time. And so those skills will be required. My belief is, even if we move faster than anybody predicts to a hydrogen economy, it's the same skills. In the oil and gas industry, at least it's the same skills. It's the same gas processing plants, it's just a different gas. But with all of the same explosive hazards, all of the same safety case issues that you have to manage, and those same skills to operate those facilities will be required. And I would think it'll be very much the case in mining, with the focus being on decarbonising mining, helping mining decarbonise so that it can have a much smaller emissions profile in the future. But again, the best outcome is that we can keep these industries strong, thriving, and have the same people or the next generation coming through with the same skills, the same job opportunities that our generation has had.
Thank you, Kevin, for a wonderful talk. My name's Hedley Widdop from Lions Selection Group and also on the steering committee of the Melbourne Miners Club. I thought it was very thought-provoking, particularly what you said about carbon capture and storage, and this is a new area of business for natural gas producers. I'm wondering if you can cast your mind, say, 20 years into the future, or perhaps not even that far. At the moment, natural gas producers have a margin. They produce the gas, they sell it, they extract their operating costs and amortisation of capital. In some cases, eye-watering IRRs, and that's part of the attraction of the business. If you move into carbon storage, what do you think those IRRs or even operating margins are likely to look like? And it might not be quantifiable, but do you see these becoming narrow margin businesses or maintaining their margin on the basis of diversifying maybe 50-50 into production as well as carbon storage? And I apologise, before I finish, I'm sitting on a table of students here. They're the future of the industry. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to give them as a way for the future, just a bright spot to look for, particularly as you've spoken a lot about the future and how the industry is changing. Thanks very much.
Well, first of all, given the introduction that I had earlier and that you just gave me about the students at the table, I'll offer them an interview anytime they would like one. I shouldn't probably do that, that's poaching, but look, I think one of the great things about our industry, our sectors here in Australia, is that we attract wonderful, high-quality graduates and students into our industry. I mean, we've got some of the best talent attracted to our industry here in Australia than I've seen anywhere else in the world. For a long time, it's not been the most popular sector in other parts of the world to attract the best talent. We still do that here in Australia. I keep dropping everything here. Excuse me. I'm using my arms too much. But I think you've got a wonderful opportunity in front of you for decades to come. Australia's wealth is built off of this sector, and it will continue to be built off this sector for a long time to come. And I think the opportunities in decarbonisation are really, really exciting. The question you asked me about margins, how will doing this affect our margins, I pointed to the fact the US and other jurisdictions around the world are incentivising. So in the US, for example, they've got the 45Q tax incentive, which is equivalent to giving a company $50 per tonne subsidy, if you want to think of it that way, for storing carbon. And so companies are investing. There's a lot of projects. I talked about 27 operational, but I think there's more than 100 in the pipeline right now in the US because that incentivisation is driving investment. What I've said to my guys here in Australia is I want to do CCS, but I want to make money from doing CCS. So we've got to do it profitably. And hence, it can't just be taking our own carbon. Now, to be fair, the Australian government, I think, have done a wonderful thing in allowing CCS to qualify for the generation of carbon credits. I'm always astonished it took so long to get there, given it's one of the few that actually you can measure the CO2 that you're putting in the ground and permanently storing deep underground. But it's an incentive, and that has helped us to be able to push forward on the Moomba project, for example. But I also think that, one of my favourite TV programmes of all time was The Sopranos. I don't know if you've watched The Sopranos, right? But I think of it as like, I'm into waste management. I don't know if you remember old Tony Soprano telling his kids he was into waste management. We are thinking about building, and our ambition is to build a waste management business, and that waste being CO2, right? And we think utilising the vast depleted gas reservoirs that we have around Australia that we've been emptying for the last 50, 60 years gives Australia a really strong position in this region. A region in which Australia would be seen as one of the countries that operates at the highest standards from an integrity of accounting, an integrity of management, environmental standards, that we can do this and you can rely on us to secure that CO2 and store it permanently underground in the reservoirs it came from originally. And I believe we can do that commercially and economically, and that's good for our combined sectors, whether it be oil and gas or the general resources sector. I think that'll be good for us. Thanks. Sure. Oh, no.
Hello, Kevin Knoll here from 3D Oil. Really enjoyed your talk today, particularly like the global perspective. It's really good to hear that. Now, one of the things I fear in Australia is that a lot of politicians don't really understand energy. I know you do. It does scare me. And there's a saying in the energy sector, in the battle of platitudes versus physics, physics is undefeated, okay? So one of the unknowns for many people in this country is that renewables currently need high quality energy, which renewables don't supply currently. So the renewables in this country are largely made in China with coal and unregulated labour, unfortunately. Can you see a future where gas will be used in this country to make renewables and a manufacturing business as well, as we deindustrialise down to China?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think when it comes to manufacturing in Australia, I share the aspiration to make Australia a manufacturing powerhouse. I think it's a great ambition, and we should be doing everything we can collectively as industries and governments to try and make that happen. What I would say is, though, it's not an easy challenge. I look at three things to be strong in manufacturing. You've got to be close to markets, labour costs and productivity, and energy costs, right? For 30 years, we had the lowest energy costs in the world. But the other two, we couldn't quite get right? And so yes, we had some and have some manufacturing, but not at the scale we'd love to go to. And so a lot of primary industries here in Australia, but the secondary value add stuff really has never developed. And I think distance to markets and costs, the costs of production, have always been something that's hurt us. Now, if we go to high energy prices, then we've got the trifecta we've got to overcome. And so it's only going to become harder to build that manufacturing superpower. And I think that's why it's time for us all collectively, the buyers, the suppliers, and the governments, to really sit down and think about a 10, 20-year view on energy policy that allowed us to stay competitive, or at least competitive. I would say trying to get low-cost energy to give us at least one advantage in those three areas that helps us build that manufacturing capacity here in Australia. Otherwise, I think it's going to be a very tough upward battle. Yeah.
Last one.
Last question, okay.
Thanks, Kevin. Brian Phillips. My affiliation is with the wood merchant who supplies firewood in the eastern part of Melbourne, because it sounds like I might have to get close to him with the shortage of gas coming. Can you just tell us how, when it's so simply explained to 600 people here today where we are and where we can get to, how are you, as probably one of the leaders in this business, going to convince the people we've just elected and the others to adopt what is necessary to ensure that we get to the story that you've talked about?
Look, I'm not sure if I heard all of that, but I think it's about how am I going to kind of be able to work with government to get them to proactively put in place policies that will support, I guess, more gas and the decarbonisation stuff that I talked about in my speech. Look, it's going to be tough, right? I mean, I've heard some very encouraging things from the Treasurer over the last few days in terms of relying on the science. You know, that's a phrase we've all heard a lot in the last 2.5 years, isn't it, that we're relying on the science. And I'd love us to rely on the science when it comes to resources and oil and gas, because it's overwhelming. 14 inquiries, a bunch of moratoriums, and various other reviews have all concluded the same thing. I talked about the $1.5 billion or so we've invested trying to get the Narrabri gas project up and running. We've almost exhausted all the different red and green tape and legal avenues of challenge that project can have. And even the IPC, the Independent Planning Commission, when they did the review of it, found it really difficult to reconcile the concern about this project with the reality of the project. But yet, years and years later, we're still trying to get a project up and running, which will bring around 150 terajoules per day of gas to the East Coast domestic market. It's 100% dedicated to that market, but we're still working through those hurdles, and we have been for many years. So look, I think there's a collective effort required. I don't think it's just governments. You know, the policy failures are more than 10 years in the making. This train left the station a long time ago. And we've been warning about it coming, and it seems to be arriving. I'd call on governments to work with industry, the buyers and the producers, to get together to see how we can resolve this pretty quickly, because it will not get better soon if we don't bring new supply to market. And it goes back to Noel's question also. The answer to this is more supply, and it always has been. If you want to get prices down, you want to get gas available, and you want to have an energy cost advantage, more supply is the answer. Choking supply will lead to higher prices, scarcity of gas, and it will shut manufacturing down right across the country if we cannot replace it. Because what I think you're seeing in Europe and what you're seeing on the East Coast today, you turn the gas off, there is no substitute. You know, people can talk about going to substitutes. There is no substitute for many of these businesses. It does not exist yet. It's unproven. It's in prototype stage, many of it, and it's decades away. And so we need to keep the gas flowing. Thank you.
I'd like to welcome Andrew Hall from EmCee to deliver our vote of thanks.
Thank you, Sally, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to give the formal vote of thanks to Kevin Gallagher for an insightful, entertaining and timely keynote address. These are interesting times, and Kevin has outlined the many challenges, but also the great opportunities in the energy sector. On behalf of the Melbourne Mining Club and everyone here, we wish you and Santos well in navigating the pathway of providing certainty during the energy transition and in the development of the next generation of technologies that enable cleaner energy and fuels. These are in all of our best interests. So please join me in extending a very warm thank you to Kevin by showing your appreciation in the usual manner. Thanks, Kevin.